Well, thank you very much, John. Just going to share my screen. All right, sorry, I'm just going to set myself up. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay, cool. Get everything in the right place before I start talking. Okay, cool. Thank you very much for that introduction, John, and for this opportunity to present to you and your colleagues. It's really nice. I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, so I'm going to give just like really broad overview of the work that JPAL does and, you know, the basic concepts of a randomized evaluation, and then give a few examples of work that's been done in Kenya, and then spend a bit of time talking about different opportunities we have to support African scholars specifically, because that's an area of work that we've been trying to improve in the last few years, and we're putting more effort into it. That's actually what got me my job at JPAL Africa, and I joined there a few months ago. All right. So yeah, I'm just going to go through who we are and what we do. Some of you may already know that, so just bear with me if you do. Look at how to measure impact using randomized evaluations, but just really the basics of why we believe this is the most rigorous method in impact evaluation methodology. I'll then take you through 3 examples of RCTs conducted in Kenya over the last decade, just to give you an idea of the kind of breadth of programs that can be evaluated and their impact on policy. And then, as I said, take you through some opportunities that we have for African scholars. All right. Oh, and please, if you have questions, maybe post them in the chat as we go. And John, maybe you can just keep an eye on them and interrupt me at some point if there's a question that looks like it should be answered at the time, or I can answer it later at the end of the session. All right. Okay, so JPAL stands for the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, and it began in 2003 at MIT in the United States. It's a network of over 225 affiliated researchers. That number seems to get outdated very quickly because new researchers are being added, you know, relatively constantly. And they're based at leading universities around the world. So we've got some of the logos there from universities. Quite a lot of the affiliates are currently based at European and US institutes, but the number based at institutes in lower and middle income countries is growing over time. Within Africa, we have 22 affiliates and invited researchers based at universities in Ghana, Zambia, South Africa, Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya. So there are 7 regional offices around the world, as well as our headquarters, which we refer to as global, and that's based in Cambridge in the United States. So the regional offices, there's also an office in America, kind of focusing on work in North America. Then there's Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, Middle East and North Africa, Europe, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. So we really do try and have a global reach and global impact. Each office is based at a university and supports work across the region in which it's based. So the Africa office at which I am has been open for just over 10 years. We're within the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. And then each office has 2 scientific directors who come from our pool of affiliated professors, and the pool of the most experienced affiliated professors. And my office's scientific directors are Isaac Mbiti and Tavneet Suri, both of whom are from Kenya. And so in terms of implementing research, the JPAL Africa team only works on interventions in South Africa in terms of actually implementing research. And then for research in other African countries, we generally work through our sister organization, IPA, or Innovations for Poverty Action, which has offices in many African countries, including a big one in Kenya. So what exactly do we do? We have 3 main components to our work. First, research through what we call initiatives, and I'll refer to initiatives a few times during this presentation. We raise money from donors to fund new cutting-edge research that answers important policy questions and fills in evidence gaps. All of the research we fund takes the form of randomized control trials or randomized evaluations, 2 names for the same thing, as they represent the gold standard for estimating impact. In terms of policy outreach, We draw out policy insights from this research and publicize important findings widely. I think we're probably all aware policy makers don't often read academic papers, so JPAL plays a role in translating that work into more accessible formats. Part of policy outreach also includes working closely with specific partners to provide funding, technical assistance, and training to help shape programs and policies that deliver results. And so, for example, this often involves working directly with government ministries. So in South Africa, we have some ongoing work with one of the provincial education departments around a CBT and a cognitive behavioral therapy inspired intervention in high schools. And in Nigeria, we're working with one of the state governments to design a program to support girls' agency and education. Finally, our third bucket of work is capacity building. So here we promote the use of randomized evaluations through both in-person and online courses. And we also build freely available tools so that others can conduct randomized evaluations. And I'll provide a bit more information and links to these later in the presentation. So JPAL works across a broad range of sectors, and sectors are the word we use for areas in which research is concentrated around a specific topic. We currently have 10 sectors, which are shown on the slide, and an 11th one is being added soon, which focuses on human rights. Each of these sectors is led by 2 co-chairs who are JPAL-affiliated professors with expertise in that area. And then they work with a team of staff members to share their research with wider audiences and draw out key policy insights. Our network of affiliates has carried out more than 1,000 randomized evaluations in over 90 countries around the world. At JPAL, we really benefit from seeing the big picture. So we take this vast body of research and we find cross-cutting themes and pull out policy lessons to inform future programs and policies. And the impact of this vast body of work, the impact that it's had on the field of development economics, as well as its impact on policymaking, led to 2 of our founders, Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, and then a long-standing JPAL research affiliate, Michael Kramer, winning the Nobel Prize in 2019 for their pivotal role in leading this movement. And as mentioned already a few times, we don't stop at the evidence generation point. We put a lot of time and effort into making sure that those projects that are found to have impact and be cost effective are scaled up to reach as many people who could benefit from them as possible. So as a result, ever increasing numbers of people around the globe are being reached by such programs, from 23 million in 2008 to 400 million in 2019. One of the programs that has contributed substantially to this number is a deworming intervention in primary schools that was first tested in Kenya. So I'll be talking about it a little later in the presentation. All right, so now that you have a broad overview of JPAL, I'm going to move on to understanding the basics of impact evaluation and why we focus specifically on randomized evaluations. So just a really introductory start point is let's understand where impact evaluation sits in the larger world of evaluation in general. So the outer circle is all types of evaluation. Within that, we have program evaluation. So program evaluation is a subset of evaluations that have to do with programs or policies, or more generically, interventions. And program evaluations can be descriptive, they can be normative, or they can be cause and effect, or they can have elements of all 3. So descriptive, just explaining the state of the world. Normative, comparing the state of the world to some idea of what we want the world to be. And cause and effect, seeing what effect a particular program has had. So impact evaluations are then a subset of program evaluation, and they're program evaluations that specifically seek to answer the cause and effect questions. And then finally, randomized evaluations or control trials are a type of impact evaluation. Monitoring on the right-hand side can form part of all types of evaluation, but it isn't a substitute. Rather, it's something you do at the same time for a different purpose. So for example, monitoring is used to see if a given program is being implemented as intended. It wouldn't tell you anything about the impact of the program. So there are 5 components to program evaluation, and each helps you to answer a different thing. So let's start with needs assessment. A needs assessment identifies what the problem is and why the problem exists. So for example, the problem might be high rates of diarrhea among children, and the reason for that diarrhea is they're drinking water contaminated with E. coli. And why do we care? Well, diarrhea is a problem because it causes malnutrition and makes children susceptible to other illnesses, which in turn can have large knock-on effects on education and employment later in life. So once you've identified the need, then you have an idea about how to solve that need. You come up with a theory of change, which lays out how does the program fix the problem? What are the inputs and activities of the program, and what outputs, immediate outcomes, and final impact do you expect them to have? So in the case of the example of diarrhea among children, your theory of change might be that providing chlorination tablets to each household allows the household members to purify the water before it's drunk. That eliminates E. coli, reduces the rates of diarrhea. And then in turn, children are better nourished, they're sick less often, they don't miss school, they have better educational outcomes and other outcomes later in life like employment. So with the process evaluation, we're now evaluating whether a program works as planned. So you're busy implementing the program and you're wanting to see if it's being implemented with fidelity and are you seeing the expected outputs? So for example, are the tablets being delivered as they should and are households using them correctly? The next step then is impact evaluation. So with impact evaluation, we want to know if the program had an impact on the outcome of interest and what was the magnitude of that impact. So continuing with the example, how are rates of diarrhea impacted by the program? What are malnutrition rates, school absenteeism rates, and educational outcomes? And then finally, we come to cost-effective analysis, which allows us to see how much impact is achieved per dollar spent. And this is particularly useful if we have a few different programs to choose from, and we want to make sure we put money towards the most effective method. So does spending $1 on chlorination tablets reduce the incidence of diarrhea more or less than spending that dollar to improve the treatment of water before it enters the system? Or does spending $1 to reduce diarrhea rates have more or less of an impact on educational outcomes than directing that money to other interventions, such as maybe food vouchers? So while JPAL's work will typically touch on all aspects of program evaluation, the core of our work is impact evaluation, so that's what I'm going to focus on. All right, so this graph, very abstract graph, shows an unspecified outcome that is increasing over time. And they'd say this is an outcome we want to increase over time. So educational outcomes, not malnutrition. At the time that the program starts, we can see an increase in the slope of the line. So it becomes steeper, meaning the outcome increases more rapidly over time after the program is implemented. What do you think the impact of the program is? Looks like it might be positive, but do we actually know enough to conclude that? Well, let's think about how we define impact. We define impact as a comparison between what actually occurred, which is the factual or the outcome after the program has been introduced, and what would have happened in the absence of the program, or the counterfactual. Note, we can only observe one of these, the factual. We can never observe the counterfactual. This might seem obvious, maybe it's not. The reason is because time only moves in one direction. We can't go back and see what would have happened to those same individuals had we not delivered the intervention. That is the true counterfactual, the same individuals without the intervention. In impact evaluation, whatever method you use, you are trying to estimate the counterfactual. In other words, you're trying to come up with your best guess as to what would have happened to those same people if the program had not been implemented. So going back to that graph, let's add in the counterfactual and see how that informs our interpretation of the impact of the program. So the blue line indicates the counterfactual. It shows us what would have happened to the outcome in the absence of the program. The difference between the blue line and the yellow line is the impact of the program. In this case, the blue counterfactual line is below the yellow line, and that means that the outcome is higher after the program is implemented than it would have been without the program. So now we know enough to conclude that the program has had a positive effect on the outcome. Of course, you may actually find the opposite. So this would be depicted as the blue counterfactual line lying above the yellow line. And it shows that the impact of the program was to decrease the outcome in comparison to what it would have been without the program. So in this example, the increase in the outcome is smaller than it otherwise would have been, meaning that the program actually had a negative impact on the outcome. And this graph makes it clear that simply seeing an increase in the outcome over time doesn't mean that the program had a positive impact. Accurately constructing or estimating the counterfactual is key to being able to reliably measure the impact of the program. So then, of course, that leads us to the question of how do we do that? So again, because a true counterfactual can never be directly observed, the main goal of an impact evaluation can be viewed as an effort to construct or mimic the counterfactual as closely as possible. So this is usually done by selecting a group of individuals that did not participate in the program. This group is usually referred to as the control group or the comparison group. Those terms are the same. And how this group is selected is a key decision in the design of any impact evaluation. The idea is to select a group that we have good reason to believe is very similar to the group that received the program in all ways except one, their exposure to the program being evaluated. So in other words, we want the only difference between the two groups to be that the one received the program and the other did not. The goal in the end is to be able to attribute differences in outcomes between the group of participants and the control group to the program and not to any other factors. So the critical objective of impact evaluation is to establish a credible comparison group, a group of individuals who, in the absence of the program, would have had outcomes similar to those who were exposed to the program. In other words, that old phrase, we want to compare apples with apples. However, in reality, it is generally the case that individuals who participate in a program and those who do not are different. So why is this? Well, programs are often placed in specific areas, for example, in a poorer area or in a richer area, or in an area with a higher prevalence of malaria, etc. Secondly, eligibility criteria are applied. So for example, on the basis of poverty or employment. So the program is only open to a specific type of person. And then in addition, the decision to participate is often voluntary. So we need to consider the possibility that those who choose to participate are different to those who don't, even among the group that are all eligible. So for all of these reasons, those who do not participate in a program are often not a good comparison group for those who did. Why? Because if the two groups are different, we don't know if any difference in outcome between the two groups is due to the program or rather due to differences in the characteristics of the group members. All right. So we know that the group of people who don't participate in a program are unlikely to be similar to the group that does for various reasons. That might suggest we give up and go home and not bother to try and estimate the impact of a program, but of course that's not what we do. Over time, researchers have come up with various ways to create the comparison group, which can be broadly separated into experimental and non-experimental. So first there's the experimental method, where there's really only one true method, but it goes by many names. And as I have done already, I typically refer to it as either randomized evaluation or randomized control trial or RCT. There are quite a few different non or quasi-experimental methods. Quasi-experimental just means a method that tries to mimic the experimental method, but isn't truly experimental. So there are a lot of different non or quasi-experimental methods, as you can see, and I don't really have time to go into them here. But suffice it to say, each one proposes a different way to create the comparison group. For example, the comparison group can be the participants themselves before the program started, or those who were eligible for the program but did not participate, or ineligible non-participants who are matched to participants using statistical methods. So the downside with all of these approaches is that they require strong assumptions in order to conclude that any differences in outcomes between the participants and the control group after the program can be attributed directly to the program. For example, these non-experimental approaches to constructing a control group require us to assume that the two groups were comparable on average before the program started. And note that this means comparable, including comparable on observable characteristics such as height and age and weight, income, education level, as well as unobservable characteristics like inherent personality traits related to determination and motivation, etc. And moreover, we also need to assume that no other factors besides the program affected either group's outcomes over time. So we've got to assume that there's no other event that could have affected outcomes. And because it's not really possible to test these assumptions, we cannot know for sure whether the changes we observe are caused by the program or by something else. So randomized evaluations don't require us to make these assumptions. Why? Because in a randomized evaluation, participants and non-participants are randomly selected from a sample of eligible program participants. So how does this work in practice? Before the program starts, you identify the population of interest, and then you randomly assign individuals within that population to two groups. In expectation, the two groups have comparable characteristics at baseline. So just to note, two randomly selected people, individuals, may look very different to each other, but as the sample grows, both groups will look more and more on average like the underlying population, and the differences between them at baseline, between the two groups, are likely to be negligible. And this is one of the reasons that randomized evaluations can be quite expensive. You need to have a big enough sample size to be sure that the two groups are the same on average. So if you do have enough people in your sample, randomization will ensure that the only systematic difference between the two groups is the presence of the program. We can therefore assume that they are comparable in terms of average individual characteristics. And that means that we can attribute the difference in outcomes to the intervention with a high degree of confidence. That is, randomization allows a causal interpretation of the difference between the intervention and the comparison groups. So the explanation I just gave uses the simplest model where there's one treatment group and one control group, and randomization is done at the individual level. Of course, in reality, there are many variations that you can do in RCTs. So often there is more than one treatment group. Sometimes mutually exclusive treatments are administered to each group, so totally different treatments, while in other cases, the treatments might be similar or overlap, or say just vary in intensity. Another variation can be in the level of randomization. So sometimes it isn't desirable or feasible to randomize at the individual level or even the household level. So you have to use another unit. So for example, a program that's about tracking nurse attendance might be randomized at the level of health center. So all nurses in treatment health centers, for example, have to clock in and out in a new system, while those in control centers do not. A program that wants to assess the impact of improving school infrastructure and educational attainment would be done at the school level, as all students at a given school will likely benefit from the improved infrastructure. If you had a program where you wanted to track the extent of government corruption, the unit of randomization would be local government. And finally, if you were doing something like sinking boreholes to improve access to clean water, the unit might be the village. So I'm just going to lay out 8 steps to explain a very simplified description of the process. And the idea is to give a complete picture on how this works in a typical evaluation. So the first step is to design the study carefully. This includes conducting a needs assessment to ascertain what the extent of the problem is and what's causing it, as well as creating a theory of change to map out how the proposed intervention will address the problem. Once the sample has been identified, people, or sometimes other units like we've just discussed, are randomly assigned to treatment and control groups. Baseline data on relevant outcomes is then collected, and you use it to verify that the randomization resulted in groups that look the same on key observable characteristics. So even if the randomization process was done with fidelity, maybe it was you were drawing numbers out of a bag or you stated to generate a random number, even if you did that properly, there's always a chance that the groups are not balanced. For example, maybe one ended up with more women than the other, or more high earners, or more employed people. So that always can happen out of chance. The bigger the sample, the less likely that is to happen, but it's always a possibility. So you always check with your baseline data. And if the randomization really didn't work very well, you'd have to redo it. And academic papers on RCTs will always talk about the balance in their groups. Then once the program's up and running, ongoing monitoring is important to make sure it's being implemented with fidelity. So key thing to check is that the treatment groups are receiving the correct intervention and the control group is not receiving anything. And that is where a lot of time and effort has to be spent, and often you will find, well, it depends on how well you have the implementing partner on board, but that is where a lot of things can go wrong. Not quite finally, you collect follow-up data at the end of the project. And if the project allows, you might also do midline data collection as well. And then using the data collected, you estimate the program impact by comparing the key outcomes of interest across treatment and control groups. Knowing whether that impact was significant is key, and that's not just statistical significance, but also practical significance. So it might be the case that income rose in the treatment group by 2%, more than it did in the control group. And this difference is statistically significant, but is it practically significant? Is a 2% increase likely to make a real difference to people's lives? All right, so I've given you a very broad overview of RCTs. Now I thought I'd give you some practical examples of randomized evaluations conducted in Kenya by JPAL affiliates over the last 10 years. So just to note, almost 80 projects have been implemented in Kenya in total, with some of those, the bulk of those completed and some of those ongoing. All right, so the first project I want to look at is an HIV/AIDS prevention project through providing a relative risk information campaign to teenage girls. So this study was conducted between 2003 and 2005 by Pascaline Dupart. In terms of the context of the project, across sub-Saharan Africa, at the time, about 2 million new infections were taking place, and 1/4 of those were among people under 25. The great majority of those infections among people under 25 were as a result of unprotected sex. In 2005, approximately 7% of Kenyans were infected with HIV. And in Kenya, as in most African countries, 25-year-old men are far more likely to have HIV than 16-year-old adolescent boys. And so that means that sexual relationships with older partners, often called sugar daddies, are particularly dangerous for adolescent girls. So in terms of the study design, although the Kenyan Ministry of Education, Science and Technology integrated an HIV/AIDS education curriculum into the primary school curriculum in 2001, by 2003 it hadn't been fully implemented. And it also didn't include information on the distribution of HIV infections by age and gender. So in other words, it didn't provide information on the relative risk of having unprotected sex with people of different ages. So to test whether providing that information would have an effect on sexual decisions, a relative risk information campaign was implemented in 71 schools that had been randomly selected from a total of 328 primary schools involved in another HIV intervention evaluation. So the intervention involved a trained project officer visiting each of those 71 schools and speaking to grade 8 students for 40 minutes. Students were shown a 10-minute educational video on sugar daddies, after which there was an open discussion about cross-generational sex. During the discussion, the project officer wrote on the blackboard the detailed prevalence rates of HIV, disaggregated by gender and age group, in the nearby city of Kisumu, which was a place familiar to the students. So in terms of results, the intervention had a significant effect on both the amount of unsafe sex that adolescent girls were having, as well as the amount of cross-generational sex. So in terms of reducing unsafe sex, this was inferred from the fact that the incidence of childbearing dropped by 28%. So it dropped from 5.4% of girls getting pregnant within a year to 3.9%. In terms of cross-generational sex, it was found that the rate of childbearing with men who were 5 or more years older fell by 61%, with no offsetting increase in childbearing with adolescent partners. When possible, it's ideal to know the cost effectiveness of the program as well as its impact. As I mentioned earlier, if you've got multiple programs to choose and limited budget, which is always the case, you want to know which has the most impact for per dollar spent. So, but obviously sometimes cost effectiveness can be a little tricky to estimate. Here it was estimated that the program cost $98 per pregnancy averted. And then in terms of per HIV infection averted, they had a range of estimates from as low as $400 to as high as $2,000. There's a link at the bottom of that slide for you to read more, and I will be sharing these slides after by email for anyone who'd like to see them. Okay, so the second RCT I thought would be interesting to take you through is the long run and intergenerational impacts of child health gains from deworming in Kenya. So I mentioned at the beginning that deworming was one of the earliest big RCTs to be done by JPAL, and it's one of the RCTs that has led to the greatest impact in terms of being scaled up to reach a large number of individuals. So this study was conducted between 1998 and 2021, so this year, by Edward Miguel and team. So just to note, if you go onto the JPAL website, there'll be a shorter term study conducted in the earlier 2000s about kind of the shorter run impacts of deworming. And now the one I'm referring to here, we'll talk a little bit about those findings, but it's a longer run follow-up that looks at employment outcomes of, okay, so as I said, the study was conducted between 1998 and 2021. So context. Intestinal helminths, which includes parasites like hookworm, roundworm, and whipworm, infect more than 1 in 4 people worldwide, and they're particularly prevalent among school-age children in low and middle-income countries. So in Busia district in Western Kenya, an environmental assessment found in 1998 that over 90% of individuals in the area were infected, and over 1/3 of these individuals had moderate to heavy infections. So light worm infections are often asymptomatic and don't cause many problems, but more intense infections can lead to lethargy, anemia, stunting in children, and may weaken the immune system. So sick children tend to miss more days of school and are less able to focus when they are at school. And so unsurprisingly, this has a negative effect on their educational attainment. At the time of the evaluation, about 1/4 of Kenyan student absenteeism was attributed to abdominal pains, likely due to intestinal helminth infections. And older children may also have missed school to take care of siblings who were sick. So in terms of the study design, the study started in 1998 in 2 divisions of Busia district. These 2 divisions had 75 schools with over 32,000 students across them in total. The 75 schools were randomly divided into 3 groups of 25 schools each. The study used a phased-in design, where the first group of schools began treatment in 1998, the second group began treatment in 1999, and the third group began treatment in 2001. The phase-in design was used because of financial and administrative constraints of the NGO that was implementing the program, and that NGO was International Child Support. So this phase-in design, this is the kind of design that is quite often used in RCTs. It ensured that all children across the 75 schools were receiving deworming treatment by year 3, but children in group 1 and 2 schools had received 2 to 3 years more deworming than group 3. So as a result, group 1 and 2 formed the treatment groups, and group 3 formed the control group, where in this case, the control is 2 to 3 years less of deworming, not no deworming versus some deworming. And the treatment entailed mass administration of deworming pills to students enrolled in school every 6 to 12 months, depending on the type of helminths prevalent in the area. So there was a follow-up study at 10 years, and then another one 20 years later, collecting outcomes related to health, education, employment, and living standards. So first, if we look at health, They didn't actually find any long-term effects at the 10-year follow-up on physical growth or body mass index, but there was some evidence of improved self-reported health and reduced miscarriage. For example, respondents in the treatment group were 4 percentage points more likely to report that their health was very good relative to the comparison group. In terms of education, in the short term, deworming increased school attendance among both girls and boys. However, at the 10-year follow-up, they did not find any evidence that it translates into improved educational performance for boys, but they did find large academic gains for girls. So in terms of that, the increased time boys spent in school seems to have gone to repeating grades, and there was no difference in the percentage entering secondary school between treatment and control boys, but the rate at which girls passed the secondary school entrance exam increased by roughly 25% compared to the comparison group. And as a result of that, that increase for girls, but effectively no change for boys, effectively halved the existing gender gap in the exam performance for that exam to get into secondary school. In terms of employment, in the 10-year follow-up, it was found that deworming had a positive effect on the number of hours spent working, particularly in non-agricultural work. So for example, the time spent working in non-agricultural employment increased by 45% for both men and women. And this positive effect on working hours was still present at the 20-year follow-up. It also led to a shift in occupation choice. Beneficiaries were 3 times more likely to work in manufacturing and less likely to work in casual labor. In terms of then the effects that this had on living standards and earnings, at the 10-year follow-up, those who'd received the treatment were found to have earnings that were 20% higher. They think that this might be because the deworming treatment led men to shift into jobs that required more work hours and offered better pay. At the 20-year follow-up, spending was 13% higher and earnings were 14% higher for those who'd received the additional years of deworming. Just to note, these positive effects on earnings were mostly concentrated in men and older individuals. So that's what's interesting and perhaps a little sad is the fact that women's educational outcomes were more positively affected by the treatment than men, but these did not translate into greater long-term economic outcomes. The authors suppose is probably because women face key economic constraints and had access to fewer economic opportunities than men. So they couldn't turn that improved education into improved economic outcomes. As a result of these incredibly large positive results, combined with the very low cost of the intervention, mass school-based deworming has been scaled up to reach roughly 300 million children in Africa and India. All right, the third program I'd like to take you through is one called High Hopes, and it's about saving for high school with a mobile money-based lockbox in Kenya. So this study was conducted between 2014 and 2015 by William Jack and co-authors. The context for the program was that, I think as we all know, saving for long-term goals can be difficult, and especially so for low-income individuals in developing countries who often lack access to easy-to-use and low-cost banking services. And one long-term savings goal is to cover the cost of transition from primary school to high school. So this can be costly for parents in Kenya because even when tuition costs are low, they'll have to buy things like new school supplies, books, and uniforms. And recent evidence suggests that commitment savings accounts can be designed with product features that help the poor commit to savings plans and overcome these barriers, and that mobile money can make this process a lot easier since it allows users to conduct transactions and basic banking on simple cell phones. So in terms of the study design, researchers partnered with a telecom operator in Kenya to evaluate the impact of a commitment savings account called the High Hopes Lock Savings Account. So the account was offered through the mobile money platform and could be opened directly from a cell phone. There were 2 key features of the account that were designed to create a commitment to saving. So the first was an interest rate bonus if savings were held until the goal date. And the second was that if the client wanted to withdraw the money before the goal date, there was a 48-hour delay between requesting the funds and the funds being released. So there were 2 behavioral incentives, one to encourage keeping the money in and the other to make it a little bit harder to get the money out early. Just note that anyone using that mobile operator could access the High Hopes account, but for this project, it was specifically marketed to parents with children in the last year of primary school. The evaluation used an encouragement design. So a total of 337 primary schools across 3 districts in Kenya were randomly assigned to one of 3 groups. Treatment group 1 was the commitment savings group. So parents from the schools in this group were encouraged to open a High Hopes lock savings account. Treatment group 2 was a regular savings group. So parents here were encouraged to open a standard mobile phone-based savings account. And then in the control, parents from schools in this group were not encouraged to open either kind of savings accounts, but they, along with parents in the 2 treatment groups, received information on the importance of saving for their children's education. And so in total, across these schools, almost 4,700 parents agreed to take part. And just that last point there, on top of this marketing aspect of providing information and encouragement to parents to open an account, half of the participants in all 3 groups, including the control group, were randomly assigned to receive SMS-based messages reminding them to save for their children's transition to high school. So the researchers collected data before the intervention and then again 6 months later to see what take-up and impact had been. So in terms of account usage, the encouragement design had a positive impact on take-up of both kinds of savings accounts. So the take-up of the commitment account or the High Hopes account was 28% in treatment group 1 versus only 1% in the control group. And the take-up of the regular mobile phone-based savings account was 60% in the treatment group 2 versus 34% in the control group. In terms of savings and loans, parents who opened either kind of savings account as a result of the project, so they didn't have one open, then they were encouraged and they went and opened an account, saved just over $11 or 1,000 Kenyan shillings in that account on average, which was about 4 times as much as the control group. And this effect on these savings came from 2 sources. So those who were already saving saved more, and those who were in debt took on a bit less debt, or in other words, they had less dissaving. And then mobile savings account usage also had an effect on other forms of saving. So total financial savings increased by an estimated $50 among participants who opened a savings account. And this positive effect pretty much entirely came from a reduction in debt. In terms of school enrollment, there was a 5 to 6 percentage point increase in high school enrollment among all participants in treatment groups 1 and 2. So across all parents, whether or not they open an account, their children were 5 to 6% more likely to enroll in high school. And then among the subset who did actually open an account, the effect was larger, with enrollment increasing by an estimated 18 to 24 percentage points. The authors don't actually know the exact means through which parents financed this increase in education, because the self-reported data that they collected didn't indicate that the increased payment of school fees was made through a mobile savings account. That being said, they did find a weak positive correlation between the balance in the account and the likelihood of enrollment. In terms of SMS reminders, those reminders that were delivered to half of each group as reminders to save for high school had no effect on either the level of savings or school enrollment. I think what the really interesting point to come from the study is that there was no significant difference in the impact on savings and enrollment between the 2 types of savings account. So this suggests that it's knowledge of and easy access to a means of savings that made the difference, as opposed to the extra behavioral incentives that were added onto the High Hopes account. Remember the interest rate bonus if they kept the money until the end of the date that they had selected, and the 48-hour delay if they tried to withdraw the money before that date. All right, so now I'd like to take you through some opportunities we have specifically for African scholars. So JPAL launched the African Scholars Program in 2019. The goal of the program is to grow the number of African JPAL affiliates who can lead the experimental economics research agenda on the continent. Why is this important to us? I think it's probably quite understandable. Local scholars in any country, whether that's Africa or in the rest of the world, often have strong connections to policymakers in their country, and they have an in-depth knowledge of local conditions, having grown up in the country. And those characteristics are really important in building strong research projects. So RCTs are often implemented in partnership with government departments who want to test a new policy and leverage existing relationships in order to identify more of these opportunities and make this process a lot smoother. And it also assists with the process of scaling up effective interventions, again, because of those connections to policymakers. And then having in-depth knowledge of the local context means that the research is more likely to fit the local context and propose solutions that are politically relevant and culturally appropriate. So all that being said, there are a number of barriers that local researchers face in being able to enter the world of economics in general and randomized evaluations in particular, some of which, maybe this is not a comprehensive list, but these are certainly key ones, which is access to research funding, especially for RCTs, which can be very expensive, connection to the networks of scholars working in this field around the globe, and exposure to randomized evaluations and training opportunities. So given these barriers, in 2019, JPAL Africa's Digital Identification and Finance Initiative, or DIGIFY, which I'll speak a bit more about later, which was led by Professor Tavneet Suri, designed the African Scholars Program, and it aims to reduce these barriers and therefore amplify the voice of local researchers in sub-Saharan Africa. So that was started in 2019. In 2021, August of this year, the Jobs and Opportunity Initiative, or JOI, became the second JPAL initiative to incorporate the African Scholars Program. I'll say more about both of these initiatives in a little bit. But just to note, we want to grow the number of initiatives with an African Scholars component over the coming years. So our African Scholars Program has 4 key elements, which I'll go into more detail in the coming slides. These are funding, application support and mentorship, training and capacity building, and finally moving projects to the next level. So before I go into those, let's just talk about who's eligible. We've defined 2 groups of African scholars. We refer to them as resident African scholars and non-resident African scholars. So resident African scholars are individuals who hold a PhD in economics or a related field and are based at an academic institution in Africa. Non-resident African scholars also hold a PhD in economics or a related field. They completed high school on the continent, but they're based at an academic institution outside of Africa. And I just want to note here, academic institution means university and does not include bodies like think tanks. DIGIFY funds both types of African scholars, while JOI only funds resident African scholars, specifically those living and working in sub-Saharan Africa. Do you want to note only one member of the research team has to meet this criteria in order for that team to be qualified as an African scholar team. This means that the team can include researchers from a range of countries or organizations. So for example, researchers who are currently working at think tanks can form part of the team as long as one other member meets this definition. And I'm stressing this point because we've had applications in the past from teams who are only based at think tanks, and they're unfortunately ineligible because JPAL only disperses funding to individuals at universities. So if you're thinking of building a team to submit a proposal in the future, just bear this in mind. So in terms of the funding, African scholars are eligible to apply for our regular funding grants, of which there are 3 kinds. So the proposal development grants go up to the value of $10,000, and they cover exploratory work related to preliminary research ideas. So that could be conducting background research, developing partnerships with implementing partners or governments, and collecting preliminary data. The second bucket includes pilot funding up to the value of $75,000. And this is used for studies with a clear research question, but for which the design and implementation requires further testing and pilot data. And the expectation with these is that they will ultimately develop into a full-scale randomized evaluation. DIGIFY also offers funding for monitoring systems in that second bucket of up to $75,000. And these systems would be ones that allow organizations to track the progress of programs by relying on rapidly collected data and easily interpretable data visualization. But that one only falls under DIGIFY and not JOI. And then our final largest grant up to the value of $400,000 is for full randomized evaluations. So these are projects at a mature level of development where applicants have a clear research question, a commitment from implementing partners, and a well-defined project design. Must note, African Scholar teams are only eligible to apply for a full randomized evaluation once they have successfully completed a pilot funded by JPAL. So in the second form of support that we're providing in our African Scholars Program, this is meant to address that we know many local scholars are well trained, but they may not have a track record in RCT specifically. And so we want to provide additional support at different stages of the funding process. So in terms of application support, during that application stage, we offer a pre-proposal call to each scholars team who submitted a letter of interest and has been invited to submit a full proposal. So the purpose of that call is to provide some feedback from the initiative's co-chairs and staff that then you can use to strengthen the full proposal. And it's also an opportunity for the team to ask us questions. We also share resources that the team might find useful related to their specific research question, including freely available training courses, as well as guides on proposal writing and project design. Then in terms of mentorship, each team that's successfully awarded funding is paired with a mentor who's a JPAL affiliate or invited researcher. Mentors provide strategic guidance and support in shaping initial ideas. They advise on the design and the implementation of the project, and they connect scholars to resources. They're also seen as a way of building a network, including you in networks of scholars working around the world. The mentorship program is not a co-authorship agreement, meaning that the affiliate that you're mentored with does not have to become a co-author on your paper, but rather the spirit of these relationships is one of mutual respect and guidance, while allowing the scholar to drive their own research agenda. In terms of training and capacity building, we've got two main buckets: scholarships. So one of our key offerings is scholarships to cover the cost of one course in the MITx Data, Economics, and Development Policy MicroMasters program, which I've linked to there on the slide. The scholarships for those courses are open to African scholars, so those already holding a PhD, as well as African PhD students and government officials. And in particular, we focus on two of the more technical courses in that MicroMasters, which cover the design and implementation of randomized evaluations, as well as data analysis. Note that all of those courses can be audited for free, but the scholarship allows you to write a proctored exam and earn a course certificate. And then the second bucket of capacity building work relates to webinars and online training courses. Throughout the year, we offer various webinar series and online trainings tailored for African scholars, and this is for anyone who's an African scholar, whether or not you've been funded by JPAL. So for example, DIGIFY ran an idea incubation webinar series this year, which aimed to help African scholars think through and refine their research ideas with the support of staff and board members before proposal submission. So the idea is to help teams think about to kind of develop a really strong proposal with the hope that then it gets funded. And then we've also run a series on building an online academic profile in order to give more visibility to scholars' work. And this is an area of development where we'll be adding things as we work out what the needs are and what's most relevant. And just to stress again, in both of these cases, you do not have to have been funded by JPAL to access these things. Anyone can apply who's either got a PhD and working at an African institution or is working on a PhD. And in terms of webinars and online training courses, that's open, whether or not you're working on a PhD or if you're working in government, it's open to anyone. So in terms of that final part of support we provide in the African Scholars Program, this is about helping teams to take their project to the next level. So that means you've completed a proposal development grant successfully and you want to now move to submitting a pilot, or you've done a pilot and you'd now like to run a full randomized evaluation. So one way we do this is to host an informal call between the scholar, their mentor, and staff once the project has been completed. And we use that call to understand what's been learned and to assist in thinking through a potential pilot or randomized evaluation. And then another way we're going to try and support this is also to run convenings of funded African scholars so that teams can share their results and learnings with each other and receive feedback both from peers from each other as well as JPAL affiliates on how to progress with their research. So as I mentioned already, the two initiatives currently running the African Scholars Program are the Digital Identification and Finance Initiative, known as DIGIFY, and the Jobs and Opportunity Initiative, known as JOY. Each initiative funds projects across sub-Saharan Africa, but they both have a list of priority countries that they're particularly keen to fund projects in, and the good news is that Kenya is on both lists. So let me just give you a bit more information about each of those initiatives. JOY's research priorities are job training and matching, job creation, and the future of work. So in terms of, it might help to give you a few examples of the kinds of questions they're interested in. So for example, under training and matching, questions are around improving the cost effectiveness of vocational training programs, reducing search barriers for job seekers, and reducing hiring discrimination. Under job creation, some questions include public works programs, supporting small and micro entrepreneurs through alternative business training models, and identifying and supporting high growth potential entrepreneurs. And then finally, under the future of work, some questions are things like preparing workers for the changing demands of the labor market, building in protections for gig and informal workers who lack access to traditional social protection, and promoting women to be fully able to participate in the labor market. There's more information on both of these initiatives on the web pages on JPAL in terms of their topics of interest. For DIGIFY, DIGIFY focuses on how African governments, private companies, and NGOs can leverage digital payments and ID systems to improve lives through better public service delivery, governance, and financial inclusion. So across Africa, governments have the potential to use digitization of financial services and identification to improve governance and improve delivery and catalyze private markets. And a growing number of African governments have already begun pursuing things like digitization of government to person and person to government payments, for example, tax payments and social grants. Governments have also started to integrate access to and delivery of key services under one unique biometrically authenticated ID system. So while governments are already moving ahead with these programs, evidence on the benefits and the challenges of these digital systems is limited, particularly in African countries. And so DIGIFY aims to fill the gaps in knowledge by funding cutting-edge research projects focused on the study of innovative government payment systems and ID reforms. So concretely, some questions they are interested in. Do digital ID systems assist or hinder in reaching marginalized populations? How do digital IDs affect voter participation, the fairness of elections and electoral outcomes? And how did digital payments and ID systems raise the amount of tax collected from firms that are already paying tax, either by reducing the transaction costs or improving transparency or reducing leakages? Those are just 3 examples. There are quite a lot more. Again, if you visit the DIGIFY page, they have a framing paper that explains exactly the topics they're interested in. So JOY and DIGIFY run their funding activities slightly differently. JOY uses defined funding windows, launching a request for proposals in the Northern Hemisphere spring and autumn each year. So the next RFP will be launched in late January or early February 2022. DIGIFY, on the other hand, accepts proposals on a rolling basis, so you can submit one at any time. And in both cases, the first step is to submit a letter of interest, which is a relatively short description of your proposed research project. And then JPAL staff use this to assess whether the topic aligns with the initiative scope. And if it does, you'll be invited to submit a full proposal. So almost done now. If you'd like to stay informed about funding opportunities, training courses, webinars, other events for African scholars, please sign up to our African Scholars Registry, which is the first link there. And I'll also post it in the chat just now. So the African Scholars Registry is the way we identify scholars working on the continent who may be interested in things like requests for proposals, training opportunities, etc. So this is our key way of working with African scholars and making sure that they're informed of what we're offering. Another way to stay in the loop is to sign up for the JPAL African newsletter, which currently comes out twice a year. And that includes announcements on things like upcoming training courses, job opportunities, etc., and funding opportunities. And then the final link on the slide takes you to a page on the JPAL global website where you can sign up for a few different JPAL newsletters, including one specifically on jobs being offered across all of our offices around the globe, and not just JPAL, but also IPA and other partners that we work closely with. So I will, as I said before, I will be sharing these slides, and that's how you'll get access to these links. And then this is the final slide. I won't take you through it in detail. It's just to give you some readings if you're interested in finding out more. And that first link there, JPAL's research resources webpage, is really useful. The global research team for JPAL has done a lot of work there. It's all collated there for researchers undertaking randomized evaluations, as well as those teaching the technique to others, and just generally people are interested. And there's like a lot of step-by-step guidance, which is really useful. All right, that was a lot of talking. I'm sorry I didn't stop during, but if there are any questions now, I would be very happy to take them.